G'day there, trendsetters. Welcome to my new advanced studio with this very advanced technology. I want to give a bit of a general lecture on the subject of wounds and trauma because I think it's a good background idea to give all my viewers, all three of them, hi mum, hi dad, just some background to kind of my understanding and my approach and my philosophy to understanding things and how I bring that to the Parsha and Torah learning. And it's an approach I like to call integrative psychology, and it combines evolutionary psychology with understanding of trauma and parts, which is, internal family systems, IFS, and a bit of by Richard Schwartz, and a bit of imago therapy by Harville Hendricks, and really applying that to relationships, marriage in particular, which is the most important relationship out there. So with that background, we're going to take a really big step back and start with evolutionary psychology. And we've got to start with the question, what is the purpose of life? And the purpose of life is to survive and reproduce. Now, a lot of thinkers, like people who listen to the Beat Your Genes podcast, very important podcast to listen to, Dr. Doug Lisle presents it, they will come and say, the origin of that idea is Dawkins in The Selfish Gene and Charles Darwin. But Charles Darwin and Richard Dawkins are so late to the party, it's not even funny. You know how late to the party they are? You ever gone into a party and there's not one beer available that's not been opened, there's all just half beers lying around and you can't even find corn chips to eat? That's how late to the party they are. That is how late to the party they are, because the idea that to survive and reproduce is the purpose of life, is the underpinning motivator of life, is right there in the first chapter of Genesis. Even our 5-year-olds should understand this. And that verse is chapter 1, Perek Aleph, verse 28, which is where Hashem, God, blessed and commanded all of creation to be fruitful and multiply, to pru revu, survive and reproduce. So this is the underpinning kind of motivation that is running through our biology, our genes, and then from that, our psychology, our mind. Everything that we do and think and talk about really is about how does that optimize our survival and reproduction. Now, of course, sometimes that can seem irrational, but everything has some underpinnings of that motivation. So that's the first thing. Big backup step, everything is about survival and reproduction. Now comes the Torah and Judaism, and we have 613 ways, 613 mitzvahs that overarch that and come and say, well, let's survive and reproduce ethically according to these commandments. And if you're not a Jew and you're not bound by the Torah, then you have 7 commandments which act as the umbrella for survival and reproduction. So we can do so ethically. Otherwise, we'll become absolute charlatans and Machiavellians and just pirates, really. Doing all kind of carnage and cruelty in the name of survival and reproduction, which is, of course, not ideal and immoral. So that is the purpose of life. So how do we deal with the purpose of life, and what are some of the pitfalls? Some of the pitfalls with pursuing the purpose of life and a fulfilling life and a happy life and a, as it were, meaningful life is what a lot of people call trauma, or what a lot of people call wounds. Now, to back the camera up, what is a trauma and wound? Trauma or a wound is something that typically happens in childhood, but not always, which will chronically or acutely and severely threaten one's survival. I throw out a name now, I call it an SSS. I call it a serious survival situation. Now, adding to that the idea of what Gabor Mate says, which is trauma is not necessarily what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. So when we can have a serious survival situation, something that threatens our survival and well-being, we inside have emotional, psychological reactions that will help us deal with that survival threat and adapt to it. So it's not only the genes that are being impacted, it is the psychology, it's the behavior. So there's a nature there of the genes, the genetic material, but then the nurture, the environment, then will also impact the being, the human being in this case, with a serious survival situation, trauma, wounds. And let's talk about some examples here. Perhaps, heaven forfend, you can have a child that is subject to a lot of neglect, a lack of parental involvement. You could have much more serious things like abuse, heaven forfend. You can have all kinds of things, subtle, some overt, and everybody knows their own challenges that they've faced. But also, in a way, perhaps many people will not know their own challenges that they face. That's slightly a different lecture, as we'll come to motivate why sometimes we can repress or suppress or ignore things that maybe our parents have done, or maybe some other situations that have happened to us that have been serious survival. That's a totally different lecture, but let's take it as a given that these things can happen, and they happen all too often. And in the words of Robert Bly, great book here to read, Iron John by Robert Bly, in particular for men, is that nobody reaches adulthood without suffering a wound that cuts to the core. Meaning, being exposed to a serious survival situation, which then leads to an adapted response, an emotional response, a psychological response, but part and parcel with that is some pain. And part and parcel of that is some beliefs that one internalizes, which, whilst being conducive for survival, might not be conducive for happiness or optimizing a lot of other relationships. So we've got these traumas. Now, let's understand a process of relationships. Now, this kind of tucks into imago therapy, where he says, a lot of the time, if not all the time, he says the universe, Jews will come and say, God brings together a husband and wife, a couple together. Obviously, we can throw out whatever type of couple. Obviously, it applies to every couple. They'll bring them together, and they'll bring them together as a way of dealing with these wounds. Okay, so that's the imago therapy, and that relationships come together as a means of each party learning from one another, growing from one another, and exploring together their wounds. But in that process, when we open up wounds, when we touch wounds, it's very painful, and it's very difficult, and it's something that a lot of people try and avoid. And so let's look at a Bible verse which I think kind of shows this, and then we're going to flow into Passover and IFS, an understanding of that, the Passover Seder, because I think it's just a good background thing. So this verse is coming from Bereshit, Genesis, happens to be my Bar Mitzvah Parsha. And we are in Genesis 2:21 for those playing at home. So that's Perek Beis, Pasuk Aleph. And here I've written it out in Hebrew, and I'm going to translate as I read it. Vayapel Hashem Elokim, and God cast upon man, Tardema al Adam, a deep sleep on man. Vayishan, and he slept. Vayikach achat mitzalotav, and he took one of his ribs. This is a key term. We're going to come and get a bit nuanced here with the reading. All right, and one rule of reading the Torah, the Bible, is we have the literal meaning. We have pshat, but we don't stop there. If we stop at pshat, we're going to end up as a fundamentalist or an atheist, both of which lack a nuance and depth. And just to paraphrase Nassim Taleb, we need to read things a bit deep, a bit of nuance, a bit of depth, a bit of an analysis, a bit of a broad view. And I think that's what I think they mentioned Pirkei Avos, where they said, Yafehi Torah im derech eretz. It's nice when one can have a wide, broad spectrum of wisdom, not only Torah, but derech eretz, the way the world works. And when we can integrate things like books like Iron John by Robert Bly, and philosophies and psychological approaches like IFS and Imago with the Torah, then we have a full spectrum. And of course, everything is right here in the Torah. This is the blueprint of everything. And this is the underpinnings. And together we come and see the oneness in the universe, both the physical and the intellectual, and the metaphysical. So coming back, Hashem took one of the ribs from man, Vayiskor basar tachtena, and then he closed the flesh over it. Now, anybody who is going to just look at that and maybe has read a bit of all those books that I've referred to would go, perhaps, wow, This is a really deep verse. Okay, when we're talking about man, we're also talking about the masculine energy. We're also talking about the ability to give, and we're talking about primordial man. We're not necessarily we're talking about basically the underpinnings of everything, really. The archetype, really. So there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, where is the origin of the pair bond? Where is the origin of the union, the relationship between a man and a woman in this case? Comes from a rib, mitzalotav. What is that? God, as it were, opened a wound to remove a piece of Adam, and from that he created Eve. What is the word salotav? It comes from the shorish tzelak, right? And in Hebrew we come to the 3-word roots. They call this etymology, looking at the root. So tzela. In Hebrew, litzloa means to limp. So the origin of a relationship is the wound, is one's, as it were, handicap or series of handicaps. Which is this is imago right here, that the relationship is born, its origins come from dealing with trauma, with wounds, with serious survival situations, many of which particularly happen in childhood. We can go into another lecture that sometimes things might not only be from your lifetime, they can be legacy burdens. We'll get to that. So that's the origin. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is we're asleep to this. This is all subconscious. This is all unconscious. We're hiding this stuff because there's a double sleep. There's a tardama, a deep sleep. He put that on man, vayisham, we're sleeping. A lot of this stuff is in our subconscious. It's even before our memory, before our cognitive development. And for many reasons, we'll repress it and not even want to open the door to that. And then, to add insult to injury, we have more defense mechanisms. Vayiskor basar tachtena. We close the flesh over this wound and we don't want to look at it, and we try and say, you know what, I've moved beyond that. That happened when I was 2, that happened when I was 4, that happened when I was whatever. It's ancient history. I'm now 25, 35, 45, what does it matter? 55, whatever. What does it matter? Unfortunately, or fortunately really, these things don't go away until they're healed, till they're addressed, till they're opened up. And where do we get that opening up ceremony? That opening up ceremony, look at my advanced technology here, flipping that chart. One thing I want to share with you is, this is an idea I had this Pesach, is the Pesach Seder. One of the first things we do at the Pesach Seder is we do the karpas. The karpas is the idea of taking a spring vegetable, growth, and dipping it in the salt water of tears. Dipping it into the origin, as it were, of our wound, of our wounds. And karpas, you can break that up, it's made of 2 words. Kor, which means a furnace. This is the hardship, this is the crucible, which is going to, as it were, be a painful process, but a painful process of refinement, and pas, to follow that line. So we got furnace, line. This is the message of Yitzias Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt, leaving our limitations. Before we leave our limitations, we have to come into touch with that wound. And again, coming back to Robert Bly, the wound, as it were, is a feminine energy which can give birth to something, growth, development. A lot of imagery in mythology, obviously coming, as it were, from the primordial Torah wisdom that went across the world, from Abraham and etc., etc. So, great book, Robert. This is a book I find a person can read, once every few years, and kind of highlight it in different colors, and it'll kind of capture where you are in that year. Fantastic book. But korpas, we dip the vegetable in the salt water, come into contact with our tears. What goes on in Passover? We drink 4 cups, but really there's 5. We ask the questions of 4 children, right? Our inner children, but really there's 5. What's the 5th cup and what's the 5th son, you might ask? especially you, Billy, at the back over there. The fifth son is the son that was never even at the Seder. The fifth cup is the cup for Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. These two are linked because what happens when we have the fifth cup? We open the door. We pour the fifth cup and we open the door for Elijah the prophet. We open the door for the fifth son, the son who's not even there, the inner child, that inner wounded part that we have fallen into a deep sleep. Tardema, Vayishan, we've slept and we've closed the flesh over it and we've pushed it aside. It's time to open that up. It's time to open the door and to address it. And this is really the idea of IFS, Internal Family Systems, which I think is probably one of the most crucial psychological treatments and understandings of the human psyche in there, which is that we have multiple parts inside of us. Doug Lyle in Beat Your Genes podcast will come and call this the internal audience. But I think Richard Schwartz of the IFS school explains this really well. And we're not going to go into too much depth here with the IFS. I'm just mindful of the time and my limitations of my phone. But the key part we're talking about here with wounds and trauma is exiles. And exile is a very powerful word used in Judaism, the golos. That the exile is Egypt. The exile is the hardship. The exile is the pain and suffering. But there are these parts which are really feeling that wound, which are really carrying this wound. And these need to be listened to carefully. These need to be listened to with compassion and love from the self, which is our inner pure state, which is the ani, which we referred to in the previous idea, that pure, compassionate self-energy. Now, there's a lot there that needs to be expanded more. But what I wanted to touch on was this idea of the exiles being a part of us that has suffered a wound, a trauma in our upbringing or trauma in our life history that need to be listened to. What Richard Schwartz calls it an unburdening. They need to tell their story and we need to listen compassionately. And maybe we'll need to listen to that multiple times. Now you might come and say, listen mate, that's all well and good. What's the brass tacks? What can I really do to integrate this, what you've just said, if you've followed with me thus far, mum and dad? What I think practically people can do is they can do one thing for free and see if they're interested. And they can they should search on their podcasts, Tim Ferriss and Richard Schwartz. Okay, there was a recent episode there where Tim Ferriss, who suffered some serious trauma as a child, the poor guy, he came out and actually very bravely told the world that he was sexually abused as a youngster. Came out and did a session with Richard Schwartz live in a podcast. Listen to that. And then if you want to take the next step, all you need to do, not all you need to do, a great next step would be to get an Audible subscription and get the 3-4 books by Richard Schwartz and listen to them. And so for like less than the cost of a family pizza a month, you can listen to his books, including a whole guided lecture series, guided meditation, guided self-introspection process by Richard Schwartz. And I think it's a real great investment into understanding one's inner psyche, one's internal audience, and the things that are in a way running in the background, but at times in the forefront, and are impacting one's relationships and impacting one's day-to-day existence really with life. And sometimes those difficult feelings, sometimes those really uncomfortable positions and pain, as we were touching on last week when we said Adam ki yamut ba'oil, when a person, as it were, is to pass away in a tent. So that's the kind of background, precursor, foundation, talking about exiles, and that's going to lead into hopefully my next lecture on psychology in the Parsha, coming up to the Parsha of Balak, Dir Balak. All right, guys, wishing you a good Shabbos and stay classy. See ya.